Long ago, in the ancient kingdom of Magadha, the Ganges flowed like a silver ribbon through fertile lands, nourishing rice paddies and mango groves, and carrying with it the prayers of countless souls. The capital city, Pataliputra, rose proudly upon its banks, its tall sandstone walls gleaming in the sunlight, its gilded temple spires reaching skyward in devotion to gods both merciful and wrathful. It was here, in a palace of carved marble and peacock-feathered ceilings, that Prince Devadatta was born, the only son of King Dharanidar and Queen Samyukta. From the day of his birth, the boy was wrapped not only in fine silk, but in the certainty that the world was his to command. The court astrologers declared his star chart to be the mark of a ruler who shall bend all beneath his will. The king smiled at this, the queen more quietly worried. But as Devadatta grew, her voice in his upbringing was soon drowned by the flatteries of courtiers and the indulgence of a father who believed that kindness was weakness. By his youth, Devadatta was already a figure both admired and feared. His face bore the symmetry that poets praised, sharp jaw, hawk-like eyes, and a smile that could charm a cobra. His robes were woven with threads of gold, his sandals inlaid with gems. Servants fanned him with palm leaves, even in the mildest breeze. He dined on rice scented with saffron, goat roasted with cardamom, and wine imported from distant lands. Yet, alongside such luxury, grew something darker, the belief that those beneath him existed only to serve his pleasure. When King Dharanidar died suddenly, struck by fever in the height of summer, the mourning in the streets was genuine, for the king had been stern yet just. But at the palace, Devadatta ascended the throne with the triumphant air of a man who believed the crown had been waiting impatiently for his brow. The coronation was a festival of excess. Elephants draped in silks paraded through the city. Dancers spun until their anklets jingled like rain, and the palace treasury poured gold coins into the streets for the crowd to scramble over. For a time, the people thought perhaps the new ruler would bring prosperity. That illusion did not last long. Devadatta was intoxicated not with wine but with power. He surrounded himself with sycophants, men who bowed deeply and agreed with his every whim. Ministers who spoke unwelcome truths soon found themselves dismissed, disgraced, or imprisoned. The prince began to spend days on extravagant hunts, riding deep into the jungles where tigers prowled. He took not only the beasts but the land itself, seizing villages to expand his personal game preserves. Families who had tilled the same soil for generations were driven away with little more than the clothes on their backs. The treasury, once carefully managed, began to bleed under his appetites. Taxes rose to crushing heights. Merchants who could not pay saw their shops confiscated. Farmers who resisted were whipped in public squares. The dungeons beneath the palace swelled with prisoners, many of them guilty only of speaking their minds. It was said that Devadatta could not endure the sight of wealth in other hands. When a prosperous merchant was seen wearing a gold necklace, the prince would summon him to court, admire the ornament, and request it as a gift. Refusal was unthinkable. Those foolish enough to hesitate were never seen again. The cruelty did not stop at greed. One afternoon, during a tour of the city, Devadatta passed through the marketplace. A beggar, frail with hunger, stretched out a hand for alms. The prince, in a foul mood, flicked a silver coin into the dust and ordered his guards to beat the man for blocking the royal path. The people watched in silence, their eyes lowered. They had learned that to protest was to court death. Still, resentment began to simmer beneath the surface. In taverns and behind shuttered windows, voices whispered of the days when King Dharanidar would walk among his people, when justice was swift and fair. Now, they said, the land belonged to a serpent who swallowed more than it could digest. In those days, far from the noise of the palace, an old sage lived in the shade of a banyan tree on the edge of the river. His hair was white as cotton, his robe plain, his only possession a wooden staff worn smooth by years of travel. He had wandered through kingdoms, watched empires rise and fall, and learned that power without virtue always carried the seeds of its own destruction. When travelers came to him for blessings, he listened not only to their words, but to the silences between them. He heard of Devadatta's excesses and shook his head slowly. "The wheel turns," he murmured, "and when it completes its circle, the hand that gripped the whip will feel its lash." Meanwhile, in the capital, Devadatta's pleasures grew darker still. He began to take not only property, but people, wives from their husbands, daughters from their fathers, dragging them into the palace to serve his desire. Those who resisted were beaten or killed, their bodies left at the city gates as warnings. Yet for every act of cruelty, his arrogance swelled. "The gods themselves smile upon me," he boasted to his court. "Look, does the river not flow? Do the fields not yield grain? I am the hand that feeds this land, and I may close my fist when I choose." But the river had begun to whisper another story. The rains that year were strange, arriving late, then falling in torrents that flooded the low fields. Grain rotted in the waterlogged paddies. Hunger gnawed at the poor, and even the merchants began to complain. The people's eyes, once only weary, now held a spark of something more dangerous. Resolve. And in the banyan's shade, the sage gazed at the swollen Ganges and knew the tide was turning. Meanwhile, in the capital, Devadatta's pleasures grew darker still. He began to take not only property, but people. Wives from their husbands, daughters from their fathers, dragging them into the palace to serve his desire. Those who resisted were beaten or killed, their bodies left at the city gates as warnings. Yet, for every act of cruelty, his arrogance swelled. "The gods themselves smile upon me," he boasted to his court. "Look, does the river not flow? Do the fields not yield grain? I am the hand that feeds this land, and I may close my fist when I choose." But the river had begun to whisper another story. The rains that year were strange, arriving late, then falling in torrents that flooded the low fields. Grain rotted in the waterlogged paddies. Hunger gnawed at the poor, and even the merchants began to complain. The people's eyes, once only weary, now held a spark of something more dangerous. Resolve. And in the banyan's shade, the sage gazed at the swollen Ganges and knew the tide was turning. The summer sun hung low and swollen in the sky when Devadatta, riding a black stallion draped in gold-embroidered cloth, came to inspect the flooded fields outside Pataliputra. His soldiers rode in two neat columns behind him, spears glinting like shards of fire. Peasants bent over in the mud, salvaging what little grain they could, straightened only to bow deeply as he passed. But their eyes did not match their gestures. They were flat, cold, and watchful. It was there, by the great banyan tree whose roots clung to the riverbank like the fingers of a sleeping giant, that the old sage rose to greet him. Devadatta, curious at the sight of such calm dignity in a man dressed in rags, reined in his horse. "Old man," he called down, "you stand in the path of the ruler of Magadha. Do you not kneel?" The sage smiled faintly, as though speaking to a child. "I kneel to the truth, not to the flesh in which it is wrapped." The soldiers stiffened, waiting for the king's wrath. But Devadatta, in a mood to be amused, leaned forward. "And what is this truth to which you kneel?" "That every deed is a seed," the sage replied, "and the tree that grows from it will shade the planter, whether in comfort or in darkness. You plant thorns, Devadatta, and soon they will pierce your own feet." The king laughed loud and sharp. "You dare speak of thorns to one who wears a crown? Look around you. Do you not see my power?" "I see," the sage said softly, "the edge of the cliff upon which you dance." With a wave of his hand, Devadatta dismissed him, ordering the soldiers to push the old man aside. The stallion's hooves splashed mud onto the sage's robe, but he did not flinch, only watched the king ride away. "The wheel turns," he murmured again. Not many weeks later, the final spark fell upon the dry tinder of the people's rage. In the marketplace, a widow named Kaveri sold small clay lamps to feed her 2 children. Her late husband had died in the king's prison for failing to pay an impossible tax. That day, Devadatta, passing through in his chariot, noticed the glint of gold in a locket around her neck, a gift from her mother. He ordered it taken. When she clutched it to her chest, a soldier struck her. She fell, blood staining her sari, and her cry rang out through the square. That night, whispers became vows. Farmers, merchants, even a few soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to the crown began to meet in secret. They spoke no longer of patience, but of justice. At the same time, the palace began to rot from within. Ministers, fearful for their own skins, stole from the treasury. Trusted captains took bribes from the rebels. And above it all, Devadatta, blind in his arrogance, planned yet another